Welcome to the Belmarsh Tribunal in New York City. At a historic moment and in these horrifying times, we are convening the Belmarsh Tribunal today with an important, timely, and urgent message to shed light on the horrors of war. These horrors I know, unfortunately, very well. I grew up in a country that was falling apart when I was a child. I still remember the bloody war in ex-Yugoslavia, the destruction, the genocide. I still remember the images of burned hospitals, bombed libraries, families destroyed, and futures destroyed. And even 30 years later, after this bloody war in the midst of Europe, my region still hasn't recovered. But these were, unfortunately, not the only wars I witnessed. At the same time, when Yugoslavia was collapsing, there was the first Gulf War happening, and the war in Somalia. 10 years later came Afghanistan, and then in July 2003, we watched the bombs rain down on Baghdad. And we watched prisoners kidnapped, detained, tortured at Guantánamo Bay. We all remember the orange color. By the way, this is the color of the design of the Belmarsh Tribunal, precisely because of that. The orange color and the prisoners, we thought they were all terrorists connected to 9/11. Only years or even 2 decades later, we would find out that many of them were actually innocent. They were there without trial and without charge. More detainees have died at Guantánamo than have been convicted of a crime. I'm honored today that we will also have, as members of the tribunal, a former detainee from Guantánamo who spent there 15 years without charge, but also the author of the music which was used to torture prisoners at Guantánamo, of course without his consent. 2 decades later, Guantánamo is still open. The war criminals walk free, from George W. Bush to Tony Blair and many others, while the journalists, whistleblowers, and publishers who exposed their war crimes have been sent to prison. That is why we are here today, to seek justice for the victims of war when the institutions of international law refuse to provide it or are simply incapable to provide it. In this sense, we have a second goal for the Belmarsh Tribunal today, which we are turning into an anti-war tribunal. And this second goal is to help us make sense of the crisis we face today. Following Vladimir Putin's invasion in Ukraine, the world is once again spiraling into a brutal war, perhaps even a world war. And the victims will again be the people, while the 1% and the war machine will make profit out of the immense suffering. Today, here in New York City, we stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and all those in Russia and everywhere who protest the war and fight for peace. The Belmarsh Tribunal, inspired by the famous Russell-Sartre Tribunal, is here to listen to witnesses, to consider evidence, to demand accountability for war crimes wherever they take place. Today's session, I must say, was planned much more before the current events. Originally, it was planned for the 20th anniversary of the unfortunate 20th anniversary of Guantánamo, and as part of the continuing struggle against the extradition of the publisher Julian Assange to a supermax prison, or basically a death sentence in the United States. I'm honored that we have many prominent members of the tribunal here with us, here in the first rows. But since we were organizing the tribunal for months, and due to the pandemic, many of the speakers will also be present per video. What is crucial to say is that we organized the event before the atrocities which are happening in front of our eyes. So some of the videos will be shown after our tribunal, and the videos which you will see are pre-recorded, and that's the reason why many of them are not reflecting on the current situation. But at the same time, it's important to say that as atrocities and war crimes are happening as we speak, it is important, very important, in order to prevent future war crimes, to speak about those war crimes that happened, and to speak about those people who were courageous enough to reveal war crimes. And that's why we are here today. I would like to thank all the members of our tribunal today, and the courageous people who helped us organize this tribunal in New York City today. DiEM25, the People's Forum, Courage Foundation, the Intercept, International People's Assembly, People's Dispatch, DSA International Committee, and Defending Rights and Dissent. The Declaration of the Progressive International spells out the key principle of our initiative, as true today as they were when we signed them in September last year. To dismantle war, the war machine everywhere, and to replace it with a diplomacy of peoples. I would love to end my speech and then open the tribunal and leave the floor for my dear co-chair, Margaret Kunstler, with a quote by the great German philosopher Günther Anders, who was also a member of the original Sartre-Russell Tribunal. And it's a quote which comes from a letter which he was exchanging with Claude Ederle. The older generations will remember the so-called Hiroshima pilot who didn't drop the bomb and had very serious psychological, moral, ethical problems because in a way he participated in it. So what Günther Anders says, and I think this is also my message to everyone who is watching us today and who is here with us in New York City, is the following. Since armies can reach each other regardless of the thousands of miles which lie between them, friends have to show that they are just as independent from spatial distances as enemies. So let's continue shooting our long-distance missiles of friendship to each other in order to show that those who are inventive only in order to destroy, that we are just as able to nullify space as they are. I initiate the third sitting of the Belmarsh Tribunal in this spirit, an anti-war tribunal to build a people's diplomacy and a new planetary movement against the war everywhere. Shut down Guantánamo, free Assange, stop the war. Thanks a lot.
I'm going to provide the background of 9/11, which is the background of 20 years of war, past wars of this country, and hopefully the end of Gulf wars of that nature. On 9/11, 2001, it was a beautiful, clear day, and I was riding my bicycle down the West Side Highway, and when I had reached about about half mile from the World Trade Center, I saw overhead a huge plane that seemed to be in the wrong place. And I stood there and watched it. And I was alone on that street, and I couldn't believe what was happening. And what happened that day has affected us until this day, and has caused more difficulties, more deaths than happened on that day, thousands and thousands more, based on wars, based on laws that were made out of fear just after the 9/11 bombings occurred. And what had happened was that we were told that these laws were emergency laws and that they would be changed and that they wouldn't go on forever. But those laws are still in place. And I want to give you a hint of what they are. On 9/13, Congress passed the authorization for the use of military force. And that meant that the president can use military force to attack any country, organization, or person assisted or harbored in persons to the 9/11 attack. And it could also force any country and say that they were preventing future attacks. They could start wars in any of the 37 countries where US claimed Al-Qaeda network was present, and anyone else involved in that attack. Now, that authorization of military support was followed by one more. And those two authorizations are still in effect, which means the president, the executive, without Congress, without any permission, can start a war in any of these countries, which is really frightening because it goes against our understanding of the US Constitution. We felt, and it was the understanding of the Constitution, that the most terrible power that could be expressed was the power to declare war. And in order to prevent that power from being misused, there was a tripartite form of government, which meant that Congress and the courts could oversee whether wars were appropriate and whether wars could be fought. Well, the first thing that disappeared were the courts. In the 80s and 90s, when we went to court to challenge wars, we were told that the courts were no longer open to us because courts were not prepared to hear about war. Wars became a political question that they said that they couldn't possibly understand what was happening, so they couldn't rule. Then we came to 9/11, and we found that Congress would refuse to have anything to do with wars or stopping wars. And so now we have one part of government. We've lost two parts of government. We have one part of government that can declare war. And it still exists, and it's an extremely dangerous situation. And that's why we've had so many wars since 9/11. On October 7th, we began the bombing of Afghanistan. But before that, we no, I want to go back to the separation of powers issues. What the use of military force did was a violation of the UN Charter, and meant that because wars were only supposed to be fought in self-defense, not for vengeance or retaliation. And the authorization of military force gave it the power for the president to declare war for any reason, and even to prevent crime in advance of any wars. And that led to the bombing of Afghanistan on October 7th. And it's an impossible thing to understand how you could just go to dropping cluster bombs from 30,000 feet with the decision of one person making that decision. It's a horrible situation. On October 26th, the Congress passed the Patriot Act, which is the most reactionary piece of legislation that has ever been passed in this country. It was 300 pages long, and I doubt anybody has ever read it in its full force. It was actually a copy of a blueprint of a huge book written by the right-wing Heritage Foundation, which then put, without anybody reviewing what they were doing, their thoughts about what this country should look like into a law. And it's very much like the Heritage Foundation that existed then is very much like the Center for National Policy, which exists today, which is the new Heritage Foundation. And they, too, have that kind of right-wing power that should be watched. Now we're getting to Guantánamo. On October 13th, the military order on detention and trial of non-citizens was passed. And anywhere in the world, you could hold people indefinitely, and it abolished habeas corpus. It resulted in the arrests of thousands with the help of the Northern Alliance and warlords, and people were then taken to Bagram and Kandahar. In this country, we had arrested thousands of Muslims and put them in prison for no reason at all, except the fact that they were not citizens. And it was a time that has continued to this day, because there are still people in prison without rights. And what was developed was the term I'm sorry. What? Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. Enemy combatant. And that term means that you're a person without rights. And we do that again and again. We figure out terms that we can apply to people to deny them rights. On the 11th, on January 11th, the first plane load of detainees went from Bagram prison to Afghanistan, from Afghanistan to Guantánamo, and many are still there.
Thanks a lot, Margaret, And I'm very glad that for this Belmarsh Tribunal, Margaret is co-chairing the tribunal. I'm honored to invite the first witness of the New York City Belmarsh Tribunal, who is coming at the 20th anniversary of Guantanamo. We will, of course, speak also about other crimes, about whistleblowers. Some speakers will also speak about the current crisis which is happening. And our first witness is Nancy Hollander, here with us in person, criminal defense lawyer, best known for representing 2 Guantanamo Bay detainees, and Chelsea Manning. Perhaps some of you have seen Jodie Foster playing Nancy Hollander in the great movie Mauritanian. If you didn't watch the movie, it's very inspiring. Nancy, thanks a lot for being with us today.
Thank you all. You know, I think maybe I should start the way I start when I speak in foreign countries. And when I go to other countries, some of whom don't like the US very much, I say that I come from the country that imprisons more people per population than any other country in the world. A country that has 39 people in a place in an island, and they have no rights, and some of them have been there 20 years. A country that has active military troops in 150 other countries of the world. But today, I think it's especially important to say, I come in peace. So, I really want to talk about Guantanamo. And what I want to talk about is why it's still open after 20 years. I mean, what is the problem? Half of the 39 men, there's only men there, there's only Muslim men there, there's only foreigners there, half of them have been cleared for release. Some for as long as 10 years ago. There was a task force a long time ago that cleared some of them. Remember now that there were 780 more or less men who went through Guantanamo, and after Donald Rumsfeld said they were the worst of the worst, Bush released over 500. He didn't have any tribunals, they didn't have any courts, he just released them and they went home, or wherever they went. And nobody remembers that many of them left after being called the worst of the worst. But why are these people still there? Well, there's a couple things that have happened that people don't realize. President Obama said, I'm going to close Guantanamo in a year, and we believed it. My client, Mohamedou al-Salahi, believed it. Ibrahim al-Nasri, my other client, believed it. They all believed it. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen. He had a chance. He had a chance for the 9/11, the 5 guys who were charged with 9/11, accused of 9/11, to be tried in New York. And he didn't take it. Well before Congress made any decisions that made that impossible, which it is now. Nobody who's ever been in Guantanamo can come to the United States for any purpose, for trial, for medical treatment, for anything, ever, unless the law is changed. But he did something else that people don't seem to realize. In 2008, I believe it was, the Boumediene case said that the prisoners in Guantanamo could apply for petitions for writs of habeas corpus and actually get somewhere with them. Earlier, they could apply for them, but they would have no result. Now the government was required to answer all the habeas cases that had been sitting there. And they started winning. 70% of them were winning because they shouldn't have been there, because the government didn't have even that small amount of evidence that's required for the government to, the court to refuse a habeas. This is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. This is more likely than not. Just tip the balance. The government couldn't do it, and they were winning. But what Mohamedou won his. Mohamedou al-Salahi, who you'll hear from next, he won his in 2009, 2010. And yet, the Obama administration, the Department of Justice, his attorney generals appealed them. All they had to do was nothing, and they'd leave. They appealed them. Now, you know, somebody said once in a case, an Indian case, great nations like great men must keep their word. Well, Obama didn't keep his word. And Mohamedou spent another 7 years in Guantanamo. 7 years because of that. Because when that happened, the district courts stopped. Why were they going to continue if this is what the Court of Appeals was going to do? Then President Obama did something else that perhaps was worse. There was a man who, I can never remember exactly what year it was, but he flew over near Detroit and, my 5 minutes are done. He flew over near Detroit. Just a little more. Flew over near Detroit and tried to light his underwear on fire. And he was Nigerian, but he'd been trained in Yemen by a man who actually grew up in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And so Mr. Obama said, no Yemenis go home. And you know how there are mostly Yemenis in Guantanamo now? Because none of them could go home or go anywhere. And that's on President Obama. And then we had Trump, and we know what happened. Then we have President Biden. It's been how long? Over a year? He's done nothing. These people who have cleared for release is where we start. But they can't just be released. Some of them don't have homes, some of them are stateless, some of them, their homes are not dangerous for them. There has to be a mechanism. And it just has to be set up in the State Department, and then they start going home. And all the rest of them who have never been charged in 20 years go home or go wherever they're safe. And the ones who've been charged, including Mr. al-Nasri, my client, something fair has to be worked out for them, something with due process. They don't just get shuttled to Florence, Colorado to live in a cell for the rest of their lives. Something gets worked out for them. It's not that hard, but it takes political will. It takes the political capital. It takes all of us saying to all of our congressmen and all of our senators, do it, make him do it. We need to close Guantanamo. We need to lock the door. We need, of course, to make sure Julian is not extradited. We need to get all the political prisoners out wherever they are, including journalists. We have to have journalists who can write. And if Julian is convicted of espionage, then I can't imagine any reporter willing to report on any national security case without being afraid. So that's what I wanted to say. I just wanted to talk about why it is that people don't realize why Guantanamo's still open and where some of the fault lies. And let's just maybe forget about the fault and get it closed. Thank you.
Next, we're going to have a video of Mohamedou Ould Sahi, who we are honored to have as a former Guantanamo Bay detainee. He is a witness at today's tribunal. He is a Mauritanian citizen who spent 15 years without charge at Guantanamo. In 2015, he wrote a memoir, Guantanamo Diary, and it was published.
Hi everyone, my name is Mohamedou Ould Sahi, and I am truly honored to be part of Belmarsh Tribunal in New York in the United States of America with the other 25 esteemed members. I am a former detainee in Guantanamo Bay for a little bit over 15 years. Guantanamo Bay does not belong into a democracy. Guantanamo Bay is the kind of prison that dictatorial regime set up to quash political dissent. I vividly remember the day the secret police came to our home. It was around 4 p.m. in the afternoon. It was in Ramadan. Me and my family, we were fasting as we observed this holy month every year to remember those who don't have much access to food and water as the rest of us. The police came to our home and they asked me to come with them. It is not the kind of process that involves a judge, that involves a search warrant, involves an arrest warrant. These were marching orders coming from the United States of America to a military regime that then was in charge of this country. I never understood the pain and suffering of a mother. I suffered with my own mother. I did not understand how a parent would feel when they take their children away. At least in a democracy, the police would explain to one what they are charged with and why they are taken away. I had to come with the police. I am just a regular citizen like you. I don't have planes. I don't have weapons. I don't have any of that. All I have is the law. And when the law fails, we have nothing as citizens. We have no buffer between us and the violence of the state, the violence of the most powerful country in the world, United States of America. United States of America, instead of propping up dictatorial regime, they should stand up for human rights. American people are good people. They deserve better than Guantánamo Bay. I appeal to every human being who could participate in this and support Belmarsh Tribunal to do so and close Guantánamo Bay. Guantánamo Bay is a stain on the free world. I remember one day I was in my cell. It was, I think, in 2012. And I was in Camp 5. I didn't have TV, but I could hear through the wall Hillary Clinton praising and defending human rights in China and ostensibly receiving a lawyer who was defending human rights and who was put in prison in China. I think his name was Weiwei. And she said something to the effect, China must abide by human rights and due process. And in the darkest of moments, I was laughing so hard. I was saying, is she for real? I am here in Guantánamo Bay, and you have the power, and you have the key to respect human rights. And this is making a mockery of human rights. When free countries, when the United States of America is picking on choosing when to apply the rule of law and when to abandon the rule of law, they would have no moral background to bash any other countries and ask them. All we want in my part of the world is respect of human rights. We want the same freedom that you enjoy in the United States of America, mainland. We want the freedom they enjoy in Europe. We want the freedom they enjoy in every free country. We don't want to be kidnapped. We don't want our mother to be hurt. We don't want people to join extremist group. We just want to be respected and for the law to be the master of the country and not anything else. Thank you very much. Please support our tribunal. And I can only tell you that my saving grace was art, was poetry, was writing. And I'm so happy now to be in my Dutch family, doing what I would love to do, writing and participating in this beautiful creation of art they have in this beautiful country of the Netherlands.
That my mic is off. I'm really happy that Mohamedou joined us. Unfortunately, he couldn't travel for the reasons Nancy already explained in her testimony. But I hope one day him and other former detainees will be able to travel to the United States. And I also hope, although I'm not that optimistic, that this tribunal might help actually not only to shed light, but also help to create political pressure to finally close Guantánamo. The next witness at the Belmarsh Tribunal is one of the most famous and leading public intellectuals, not only of the United States, but of the world, Noam Chomsky, a member of the Council of the Progressive International. The testimony is pre-recorded so that you know, and Noam will talk more about the broader historic and political context of Guantánamo.
Transgression. Julian Assange committed a grave transgression. He's guilty of exposing severe crimes of the US government that it has sought to keep hidden from its own citizens and from the world. Assange's transgression strikes at the very heart of systems of power and violence. That's been recognized by distinguished scholars who've had ample experience of their own in the corridors of power. Among them, the professor of the science of government at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, who explained his words that power remains strong when it remains in the dark. Exposed to the sunlight, it begins to evaporate. Well, causing American power to begin to evaporate by exposing crimes of state to the sunlight, that's no slight transgression. It's understandable that those who direct the greatest system of power in human history should seek harsh punishment and revenge. Years of cruel imprisonment and torture, with worse to come if they can get their way. And only an aroused public can prevent that further crime. Professor Huntington even provided an instructive example to illustrate this fundamental principle of government. In his words, you may have to sell intervention or other military action in such a way as to create the misimpression that it's the Soviet Union that we're fighting. That's what the United States has been doing ever since the Truman Doctrine at the outset of the Cold War. Well, those words are worth considering right now. The Belmarsh Tribunal carries forward the legacy of the Russell-Sartre Tribunal on Vietnam, the worst international crime of the post-war era, when the United States devastated Indochina while creating the misimpression that it was the Soviet Union that it was fighting, or China, or the Sino-Soviet conspiracy to conquer the world. Any pretext would do to conceal the fact that Washington's enemy, as it knew well from the outset, was the nationalist movement in Vietnam. Sometimes the truth is conceded. A window on reality opened slightly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And for a short time, it was not possible to create the misimpression that the Russians are coming. That was an interesting period. The Bush 1 administration produced a national security strategy that slightly lifted the veil. It called for intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, and then added an interesting phrase, where the actions that called for US reactions could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door, contrary to decades of prevarication. Dramatic illustration is the torture of Cuba for 60 years, including John F. Kennedy's terrorist war against Cuba, which almost led to nuclear war in 1962, and the crushing blockade that's strongly opposed by virtually the entire world, even a large majority of Americans. When the Soviet Union collapsed and withdrew its limited support for Cuba, the misimpression collapsed with it, and the US instituted still more brutal measures to crush Cuba, with Clinton outflanking Bush from the right. The misimpressions that are designed to subdue the general public are stripped away in internal documents, which are admirably frank. So the actual reasons for the torture of Cuba are explained in declassified documents from the Kennedy-Johnson years, the 1960s. Cuba's crime is called its successful defiance of US policies dating back to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which declared Washington's right to dominate the hemisphere, a principle that extended far more broadly after World War II. We have just commemorated the 20th anniversary of one of the mechanisms used to strangle Cuba, control of the Guantánamo Bay naval facilities, vital for Cuba's development. It was stolen from Cuba at gunpoint in 1903 as part of the system for maintaining Cuba as a virtual colony after the United States had intervened to prevent Cuba's liberation from Spain. Cuba's efforts to reclaim Guantanamo have been rebuffed. For many years, it was used illegally to hold Haitians fleeing from US-backed terror and misery. 20 years ago, the Bush administration moved on, turning it into one of the world's most horrendous torture chambers, still holding brutalized victims without charges. Well, information about all these and innumerable other matters was provided to American and the world public by WikiLeaks. The crimes that cannot be forgiven as power begins to evaporate when exposed to sunlight.
Who is a member of the Rage Against the Machine, and as Srećko told us earlier, his music was used against his will to torture people at Guantánamo, which was a terrible experience for him. But, you know, he's an artist and an activist, and he represents that movement, and we'll talk to you about it.
And I'm honored to take part in the Belmarsh Tribunal today. It is the 20th anniversary of the Guantanamo torture camp, and It continues to be a blight, a dark mark against human rights in the world. First of all, the outrage of the United States annexing and stealing part of the country of Cuba to erect a secret prison torture camp and rub it in the face of the world, in the face of human rights, is an outrage and should be immediately shut down. Some years ago, it came to our attention that they were using the music of my band, Rage Against the Machine, to keep prisoners up 24 hours a day, and basically using music that we had made for the cause of the liberation of humanity and human rights and social justice as a weapon of torture. We sued the United States State Department over the use of our music as a torture device, and while the lawsuit was unsuccessful, it was an attempt to sort of draw a line in the sand and say, you know, no more, and that's not what that's for. So thank you for listening. I encourage the Guantánamo Bay to be shut down immediately and to do whatever we can on that front, as well as continuing to combat the evils of U.S. imperialism around the globe and maintaining all channels of freedom of speech and freedom of press to peel back the veneer of the powers that be, to let the people shine the light in, let people see what's really going on in and outside of the darkened jail cells of Guantanamo and around the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Our next witness at the Belmarsh Tribunal in New York City is the Indian historian, journalist, and public intellectual, director of the Tricontinental, someone who has been called our own Frantz Fanon, and that's Vijay Prashad. Thanks a lot, Vijay, for joining.
Thanks a lot, Srećko. Nice to be with you, Margaret. It's an honor to come after Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine, superb humanitarian. And by the way, this doesn't come out of my 5 minutes. I want to start by saying that from Tricontinental, the institute where I work, and the International People's Assembly, we produced a text called Free Julian Assange, which you can download from thetricontinental.org. And I recommend downloading it, not for yourself, but to campaign with, to use to educate other people who might not know as much as you who have joined us today would know about Julian Assange and the open sore of Guantánamo. So please have a look at it and please share it. It's no sense knowing things, no sense being right about things if you don't do anything about it. So please take this and spread the word. Build movements against injustice and tyranny. You know, war itself is a crime. War itself is a crime. We shouldn't be talking about war crimes. War is a crime. And the biggest crime is the war on the poor. 2.7 billion people can't eat today. And that's considered something invisible. Where is the outrage in the world when children struggle to eat? 97% of the population of Afghanistan is living in poverty. And there's no urgent Security Council meeting about that. The children who'll die in Afghanistan are irrelevant. Today, the Chancellor of Germany, the President of Ukraine, and others have talked about how horrible it is that this war is taking place in Europe, as if that itself should qualify anything. As if because it's happening in Europe, it's more important than the war in Syria, or the war against the Palestinians, or the war in Yemen. Somehow, because this is in Europe, old racism rears its head. And these bodies somehow become much more important to focus upon than the bodies of those children who die around the world because they can't eat, or the bodies of the Yemenis who continue to be punctually bombed, not just by the Saudis, but by British and US arms manufacturers, BAE Systems, Lockheed, and others. War is a crime. Yes. Rosa Luxemburg put it beautifully. She said, in peacetime, workers of the world unite. In wartime, workers of each country slit each other's throats. War is never good for the poor. War is never good for workers. War itself is a crime. War is a crime. War produces crimes. Look, we know what was done to Afghanistan was an abomination. There was no good war, Afghanistan, bad war, Iraq. The Afghanistan war was a terrible war. The United States had ample opportunity to negotiate with the Taliban to get bin Laden and others and start a reasonable judicial inquiry about what happened. They didn't bother. They went and started bombing immediately because they don't care about the Afghan people at all. They don't care about the Afghan people. They don't care about any of the people they brought to Guantánamo. As Mamadou said quite correctly, they can be sanctimonious about what's happening elsewhere in China and so on, but they don't recognize the same principles against themselves. Yes, Guantánamo, 20 years, but what about Abu Ghraib? Have we forgotten so quickly? What about all the other black sites, including in some of these Eastern European countries that are now barking about human rights? Let's ask the Polish government, how many black sites did you have there? How many CIA planes flew through Ireland to Eastern Europe, bringing people to be tortured? Where are they? Where are their stories? Irrelevant in our imagination today. War produces crimes. It's not only itself a crime, it produces crimes. War also produces lies, denials. United States government lied from the first day about everything it was doing in Afghanistan and subsequently in Iraq. They lied about what they were doing. They lied about what happened in 2007 in New Baghdad city when Saeed and Nur al-Din were killed by those Apache helicopters. They lied. They were asked directly. David Finkel of the Washington Post said in his book, he said that there's a video, and the US government lied and said there's no video. It is thanks to Chelsea Manning, the bravery of Chelsea Manning, the honor of Chelsea Manning, that Chelsea Manning downloaded that video, downloaded the material from the State Department, delivered that material to the WikiLeaks organization. It is thanks to Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks organization that we as journalists were able to write about it, that we were able to see the collateral murder video about the cold-blooded murder of Saeed, Nur al-Din and others in New Baghdad city in 2007. It's thanks to them that we were able to finally not sound crazy and be able to tell our editors that this is exactly what we are seeing on the ground. Because for years, editors said, you can't confirm these things. Well, now we could. Now we could, and thanks to the State Department cables, we could confirm even more, not just from Iraq, not just from Afghanistan, but also about the black sites. All confirmed. We could confirm what was happening in the prisons of Egypt, where again prisoners were sent to be tortured. So-called curveball, the reason that the United States decided they could have an excuse to go to war, and an illegal war against the Iraqi people. War produces lies. It's thanks to WikiLeaks, it's thanks to Julian Assange that we were able to break the barrier, break the lies, and show what was actually happening. War is a crime, my friends. War itself is a crime. Of course, Guantánamo must be shut down. Who in their right mind can make an argument to continue Guantánamo, keep the 39 people? As Nancy said, most of them already cleared for release. Of course, shut down Guantánamo. That's hardly a controversial statement. Of course, free Julian Assange. How is that controversial? What did Julian Assange do that the New York Times didn't do? What did Julian Assange do that the Guardian newspaper, and to the shame of the New York Times, to the shame of the Guardian, to the shame of Der Spiegel, none of them stand with the man who provided them the information that came to him from Chelsea Manning. He is going to be charged on that Espionage Act. He should be walking into this room right now to stand here, join us, and tell us about the mechanism WikiLeaks created so that people could come in, provide information anonymously, so that we as journalists could read that information, evaluate whether it's real, and publish it. It was the New York Times that published the material that Chelsea Manning provided to the WikiLeaks organization. Where is the New York Times today? Why isn't it in this room? Why don't they cover the Belmarsh Tribunal? They will not. Obviously, shut down Guantánamo. Obviously, free Julian Assange. Today, my friends, the whistleblowers are in prison. The war criminals win awards. The whistleblowers are in prison and the war criminals win awards. War is a crime. It's up to us to stop this abomination from continuing. Thanks a lot.
Next, we're going to have a video made by Jeremy Scahill, who is one of the founding editors of The Intercept and an editor today. He has reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia, and many other places. He's a reporter who successfully got out information about war and should be congratulated for that. So now we're going to hear from him. He wants to make sure that you understand that this is pre-recorded because he doesn't talk about things that he might have talked about if he were speaking here today.
Organizers of the Belmarsh Tribunal for having me here today. I understand that the stated purpose of this inquiry is to examine the role of the United States in the post-9/11 world, its war-making, economic sanctions, torture, Guantanamo, the war against whistleblowers. But I think it's also important to remember that many of the actions, policies, in fact, wars waged post-9/11 were the product of decades of U.S. policy and had their roots in previous administrations to Bush and Cheney. In fact, the immediate predecessor of George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, under his administration, the Iraq Liberation Act was passed, which codified regime change in Iraq as the law of the land in the United States. The precursor to the Patriot Act was passed. Bill Clinton began exploring the use of so-called targeted assassination in the 1990s. Clinton also waged a 78-day bombing campaign against Serbia and Montenegro in direct contravention of direct objections from senior United Nations officials and many nations in the world, and instead used the NATO alliance to give it a veneer of international legitimacy. When 9/11 happens, you had in the White House not just George W. Bush, but Dick Cheney, whose entire life's work politically was based on the notion that the White House was essentially a dictatorship when it came to national security policy, and Cheney viewed Iran-Contra as a model, not as a scandal, but as a model for how the U.S. should conduct itself on a covert basis around the world. So, these guys were ready to roll when 9/11 happened. And what I think was interesting is that rather than it being a kind of rogue operation where Dick Cheney was pushing all of this stuff through, you had the Democrats and Republicans join together in endorsing sweeping policy, the authorization for the use of military force, the so-called blank check for war, the USA Patriot Act. The invasion and occupation of Iraq was supported by very prominent Democratic politicians, including Joe Biden, the current president, Hillary Clinton, and many others who remain key figures in American policymaking. What I reported on extensively in the post-9/11 era was the use of mercenaries in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think it's really important for people to understand that war has always been business in the United States. In fact, Dwight Eisenhower warned against the military-industrial complex and its increasing power in his farewell address many, many decades ago. What was different this time was that Bush and Cheney began embracing the widespread use of armed mercenaries. And what ended up happening was companies like Blackwater, Triple Canopy, and others, there was this profit motive built in to the waging of war. Now, being a mercenary is an old profession, but to have the United States embrace it to a degree where at times you had more private contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan than you had uniformed U.S. soldiers was quite extraordinary. And the benefits of using private contractors were many for Bush and Cheney. Number one, their deaths are not counted the same way that American soldier deaths are counted or when the body bags come home. Number two, they largely operated in a legal gray zone where it was very difficult to hold them accountable for their crimes. And number three, you could create an enormously profitable industry and give contracts to your political cronies. And in many ways, that was the entire story of the rise of the Blackwater Mercenary Company, which was founded by a very wealthy, extreme right-wing figure who was very close to the Republican Party and, in fact, to people who were in the administration at the time. Blackwater, while some of its foot soldiers did get prosecuted for killing civilians, no one at the top of that company was ever held accountable in any meaningful way for the Nicer Square massacre in Baghdad in September of 2007, where more than a dozen Iraqi civilians were killed, including a 9-year-old boy named Ali Kanani. War is very profitable, and the United States has an out-of-control for-profit war industry in every aspect of the system, from intelligence to the manufacture of weapons to the providing of soldiers. The second thing that I focused intensely on as a journalist was assassination. The United States has long assassinated people, but what we saw happen after 9/11 was that Bush and Cheney really put it on steroids, and they started further empowering the CIA and covert military units to effectively operate as global hit squads. When Barack Obama came into office, he said that he wanted to end larger scale wars, though he did surge troops in Afghanistan. But what Obama started doing was to increase drone strikes in Pakistan. He initiated a secret air war in Yemen beginning in December of 2009, and then began pummeling Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia with drone strikes. And in fact, they also killed American citizens, some of whom had not been charged with any crime or any evidence produced that they had been involved with terrorism. So these two phenomena, the use of assassination as a central component of American policy and the radical embrace of privatized warfare, deserve much greater scrutiny and hopefully will come under focus of this Belmarsh Tribunal. I thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
As I said already at the very beginning of the Belmarsh Tribunal, we are today turning the Belmarsh Tribunal not just into a tribunal which takes the name of the prison where Julian Assange is still being held, a prison which is, by the way, called the British Guantánamo, but in the future I hope there will be many other tribunals, not necessarily organized by us or our partner organizations, who will shed light on the crimes which are happening at this moment in many parts of the world, including Yemen, including Ukraine, including many other countries. I would love to thank the Intercept also for live streaming this event, and I would love them for being I would love to thank them for being a partner of the event. And I would love now to invite the next witness of the Belmarsh Tribunal in New York City, Austin González, who is a member of the National Political Committee of Democratic Socialists of America.
Greetings, friends. My name is Austin González. Thank you, Srećko. And I am a member of the National Political Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America, as well as a member of DSA's International Committee, one of our proud tribunal co-sponsors today. Speaking as a member of a socialist organization, I think it's important to note that as socialists, the fight against imperialism and the fight against the war machine is one that should always be at the forefront of any socialist struggle. Within DSA, our international committee has done a considerable amount of work over the last couple years, bringing light to war crimes that the United States government has been a part of, opposing the war machine wherever possible, rallying against the escalation of tensions with China, raising awareness to war crimes being committed in Yemen, mobilizing our chapters across the country to demand an end to the blockade against Cuba, which is incredibly relevant to any conversation about closing Guantánamo Bay. Many of our members in the DSA International Committee are the children of refugees themselves, fleeing violence perpetrated by the United States, the children of the violence perpetrated by the United States and the West, Puerto Ricans, Salvadorians, Indians, Chinese, Brazilians, plenty of children of refugees, the children of people forced out of their homes through no fault of their own, forced to leave the lands they loved, forced out due to the misfortune of being born at the lower rungs of society, deemed by our global order, targets of the West and their imperial apparatus. But it is us, the children of those refugees, that are beginning to build something new. It's all of us gathered here today that are charting a new course forward and saying enough. Enough to empire, enough to war. No more refugee crises, no more destabilization throughout the world, and in particular in the global South, which is consistently ignored. As myself, speaking as a member of the Puerto Rican diaspora, which now outnumbers the actual population on the islands of Puerto Rico, the crimes of the US empire have been readily apparent in my entire life, in my very existence here in the United States. It was this very city where we're holding this event, this very city, New York City, that my family and so many others were forced to flee to after a century of US occupation of that beautiful island of enchantment, right? It was the United States that engaged in decades of ethnic cleansing and suppression of independentista activists in Puerto Rico after the annexation of the island in 1898. It has been the United States that time and time again has quashed any calls for independence or socialism or awareness to issues that are occurring on the islands of Puerto Rico. From the suppression of those nationalist movements in the 1930s and 1950s to the suppression of socialist movements in Puerto Rico during the 20th century. We see this even in our own lifetimes, in recent decades, with the 2005 assassination of independence leader Filiberto Hero Rios. It was the United States which conducted birth control experiments on black and brown women, black and brown Puerto Rican women, during the mid-20th century, like trials which resulted in 1/3 of Puerto Rican women being sterilized. Ethnic cleansing, that is ethnic cleansing. It was the United States which tested bombs on the island of Vieques, resulting in higher cancer rates there than anywhere else in Puerto Rico. Those same Viequenses who still do not have access to a functioning hospital after Hurricane Maria 5 years ago. If this occupation is allowed to continue any longer, Puerto Rico itself will cease to exist as we know it, cease to exist. But once again, it is all of us gathered here today that will stop it, that will bring a halt to the empire. And this is what gives me hope, that one day all of us will be able to return to our homes, all of us refugees, be able to return to our homes and be with our families in peace, not suffering through the consistent threat of war. The crimes of the United States, in the Caribbean, and in Latin America as a whole, have filled endless volumes of work and analysis, rightfully so, right? It is Puerto Rican service workers that are forced to commute to places like Guantánamo Bay. Forced to commute to places like Guantánamo Bay, the United States' own personal torture chamber in the Caribbean. It is a fact that people are tortured without trial on the island of Cuba. And it's also a fact that it's the United States doing that on stolen Cuban land. It's the United States government which is guilty, unequivocally. I'd be remiss without adding, as a Puerto Rican, there is a saying in both Cuba and Puerto Rico, Cuba y Puerto Rico, los dos alas de un pájaro, right? Cuba and Puerto Rico are two wings of the same bird. This is a reference, of course, to the deep historical and cultural ties that exist between these two nations. And as a Puerto Rican, the offense of the very existence of Guantánamo Bay weighs heavily on my mind and the mind of all Puerto Ricans, all Caribbeans, all Latin Americans, all peoples. It should weigh as an offense on all of our minds. The Caribbean is not free until Puerto Rico is free. The Caribbean is not free until Guantánamo Bay is closed once and for all and the land returned to the Cuban people. No more torture chambers, no more empire, no more war. peace, sovereignty, and community for all in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and throughout the world. Thank you.
Here today with us is Claudia de la Cruz, who is the co-executive director of the People's Forum. And we're so thankful to the People's Forum for hosting us today. They've done a tremendous job, and thank you very much. Claudia is also a noted community advisor, organizer, and theologian. Here she is right now.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm a little bit short, so I'm going to do this. I want to thank Progressive International and the partners for creating the space and inviting us to participate in this Belmarsh Tribunal. This tribunal comes at a crucial time for the historical fight in defense of humanity and the planet. This mic keeps moving forward. All right. Well, as I was presented, my name is Claudia de la Cruz. I am from the People's Forum. I'm also a member of the International People's Assembly. In our organizing work with social movements and working class communities in the United States, particularly in this moment of a global health crisis and deep economic crisis, we have witnessed the neglect and the criminal disregard of the United States government for its citizens. In the wealthiest country in the world, the majority of its people, the working class and the poor, are experiencing increasing numbers of poverty, unemployment, increased levels of surveillance, police brutality and incarceration, high levels of displacement and homelessness, attacks on women's rights and workers' rights. While the state funds education, housing, and health programs, it heavily invests in military. Within his first 100 days in office, Biden signed into law close to $8 billion towards the US annual military budget. This tells us much about the priorities of the United States government, thus strengthening its dominance over the world. The United States government intensifies its imperialist offensive through institutions such as NATO, the OAS, the IMF, and the World Bank to maintain its unipolar hegemony internationally. We are witnessing how the US is consolidating political and military coalitions of Western countries against those whom it has designated as threats to US hegemony, particularly countries in the East. China, just want to put it out there. And it is using all its instruments in the development of a new Cold War. Clearly, for US imperialist forces, war, the crime of war, continues to be the answer to the capitalist economic crisis. What this has meant historically is the assassination of popular democratic processes, the killing of leaders and workers, and the suffering and misery of innocent people across the world. It has meant the social, economic, and political destabilization of the global South by the US and its allies. In this process, hybrid wars and the use of sanctions have become more prevalent. There are many examples of nations that have been battered by this type of war: Iran, Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, among others. The United States government has imposed a collective punishment on the people of Venezuela through unilateral coercive measures or sanctions that have prevented ordinary people, working class people, from accessing the most basic necessary things, such as medicine and medical supplies. If this is not criminal, I don't know what is. This is promoting and producing death. In addition to this, there's a theft of Venezuelan assets that are strangling the economy by $137 billion. The US blockade against Cuba has had a grave impact on the lives of Cubans. It has robbed Cuba, a Cuban economy, of over $130 billion over the last 60 years. This US policies produce real damage and violate the right of Cubans. They hinder access to medicine and specific treatments, as well as access to necessary medical equipment and materials. In this context of this global health crisis, Cuba has been able to produce not one, not two, but 5 vaccines. Now, that is a source of hope for Cuba and for many countries in the global south that do not have access to vaccines. Yet the blockade obstructs access to equipment and materials to speed up mass vaccination. The US blockade on Cuba is a crime against humanity. We demand an end to the blockade. It is time. Cuba's process to become a sovereign country, independent from US imperialism, is not a terrorist act. In fact, the blockade that has strangled its economy and has not allowed Cubans to live full lives is an act of terrorism. We demand the immediate shutdown of Guantánamo Bay Detention Center and the return of Guantánamo Bay territory to its people, the Cubans. The US has occupied this territory and has utilized it as a lawless territory to conduct the most hideous acts. The Gitmo files by WikiLeaks were key in revealing the most horrendous acts of torture and acts of sexual abuse endured by detainees, most of who were illegally arrested and have been held without possibility of due process. Lastly, mainstream media, the stenographers of the US state, have historically covered these atrocities and acts of terror by the US and its allies with narratives that serve to justify aggression and war. Julian Assange is being punished for refusing to follow suit and for not becoming an accomplice to these crimes against humanity. He is being punished for doing exactly what journalists are meant to do: investigate and tell the truth. The US government is one of the largest perpetrators of violence, domestically and internationally. We must denounce these crimes against humanity by the US government, but we must not stop there. Denunciation is not enough. We must organize against the crimes of war, the crimes of the United States government that come in different forms. We must organize to shut down Guantánamo. We must organize to free Assange.
Thanks a lot, Claudia. Just one comment. We are around halfway through to our today's tribunal. Witnesses who are still coming include Chris Hedges, Jeffrey Sterling, Stephen Donziger, Cornel West, and others. To repeat my point from the very introduction, unfortunately, some of the video testimonies which were pre-recorded will not be shown today, but in the coming weeks, days by days, we will publish them at the Progressive International and including our partners. This tribunal, as I said at the beginning, of course, had the original idea to shed light on the crimes of war, torture, surveillance mainly of the government of the United States. But we hope that this tribunal will also inspire other people, other tribunals, to hold accountable all other governments in the world which committed crimes and which are, as we speak, committing crimes. Let me present our next witness who flew in from Europe, Kasia Wojcik, who is an educator and organizer from the School of Resistance, who works closely with the acclaimed European theater director Milo Rau, who organized the Congo Tribunal, speaking about the crimes which happened in Congo in Africa. Please, Kasia, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you, Srećko. I'm an artist, and it says a lot about the state of the world that I'm speaking here today. And I'm happy to hear that Mohamedou is writing poetry after 15 years in prison. This gives me hope. In a moment, I will read out the witness statement by my colleague Milo Rau, artistic director of IIPM and Anti-Ghent, who's one of the founders of the Congo Tribunal, a World Economic Court that we created together with Congolese and European lawyers in 2015 as an attempt to end the opacity and structural lawlessness that exists in the field of international mining business and trade. We are very honored to be part of the Belmarsh Tribunal to share our knowledge on the power of symbolic tribunals and art. I would like to start quoting the whistleblower and former US drone engineer Sean Westmoreland, who operated lethal weapons in Afghanistan. We let children fear blue skies. A year ago, I spoke with him about truth-telling and the precedent the Assange case will hold for our democracies, press freedom, and the application of human rights for all. The lawyer Wolfgang Kalek, from our partners from the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, explained to me that the abuse of the Guantánamo survivors is one of the examples that it is not only the usual autocratic regimes that we have to hold accountable for their complex neglect of human rights. The last 20 years have shown the complete erosion of our legal system in our own democracies. The rule of law and the protection of human rights has been literally abandoned by those countries who invented it in the first place. This is a clear message to dictatorships around the world that also democratic governments do not care about basic human rights. The right to have rights, as famously coined by Hannah Arendt, can be the only base of our democratic societies we want to coexist in together. This means also exposing the insufferable abuses European politicians are guilty of concerning the lives and deaths of illegalized migrants crossing the borders of the continent I live on. These are the same children that fear the blue skies because of the war crimes people like Assange exposed. We need to hold these politicians accountable. They are the ones who have to be on trial, not a journalist exposing these terrible truths of our times. We speak out here today for the freedom of Julian Assange because the knowledge of the constant erosion of our legal system is the only way to fight for the just and democratic global society we want to live in. We, with the power of artistic practices and their utopian potential, we can shape symbolic interventions that overcome the paralyzed feeling of not having agency as political citizens at all. For that, I would like to read out now the witness statement by Milo Rau. The question I try to answer is very simple. Why do we need such tribunals like the Congo Tribunal or the Belmarsh Tribunal? Let me first clarify a term. What is a crime? When I first traveled to the eastern Congolese mining areas to prepare the Congo Tribunal around 10 years ago, I was told by the UN specialists, we are in a post-conflict zone. Although I witnessed almost weekly evictions from mining concessions and massacres of civilians, each and every one of these crimes was described as a regrettable incident, but never as a normalized part of a war that is in fact being waged by the big mining companies against the civilian population. We are in a post-conflict zone, and no conflict means no crime, only accidents. This is therefore the first reason why tribunals like the Belmarsh Tribunal or the Congo Tribunal are needed, to declare crimes as such. That is why it was important for the Congo Tribunal to work only with real evidence, with real witnesses, in front of real lawyers and real judges. Only an institution of justice makes a crime recognizable as such. One of the founders of the International Criminal Tribunal of The Hague, Jean-Louis Gillissen, the European chairman of the Congo Tribunal, was once asked why he would participate in a fictional tribunal. His answer was, because the Congo Tribunal is currently not possible in The Hague. But as soon as it will be possible, and this is crucial, the Congo Tribunal will dissolve. Opinion tribunals, people's tribunals like this, by working to enforce truth and justice, work to abolish themselves. Which brings us to the second point. There is a need for such tribunals because the crimes we're discussing here or in the Democratic Republic of Congo are systematic. In a state of exception, and state and economic power always means the creation of a state of exception, violent excess is not a mistake, but the rule. It is important to understand that in Guantánamo, we are not confronted with an abnormality, but with part of a global parallel system of injustice. In this system, human rights and even international law are only executed when they serve the purpose of power. In Guantánamo, we are confronted with a legal manifestation of what could be called the principle of extraterritoriality within the current global neo-imperialist regime. Spaces where different rights apply than within civilized spaces, in which democracy, the rule of law, and the prohibition of torture are suspended. The time is limited, so I and Milo come to our last point, effectiveness. We owe it to the victims of Guantánamo, to the estimated 5 million dead of the economic war in the Congo. We owe it to all the victims of neo-colonial violence that we leave the realm of opinion, that we leave the realm of the non-state, where we and all civil society actors are pushed by the neo-colonial regime. We must cooperate with real justice, impeach real politicians, liberate real people, change real politics, enforce human rights concretely, case by case. The first Congo tribunal led to the dismissal of 2 ministers. With the third tribunal, we supported a political initiative to convict the mining companies in their respective European home countries for crimes committed in the Congo. Last December, we sat in the parliament of Kolwezi, in the world capital of cobalt, the place where all the material comes from your phones right now, and condemned the world's largest extractive company, Glencore, for numerous crimes against humanity. All these are concrete steps, and nothing else is at stake, concrete results. For 300 years, we have been talking about enforcing human rights. There has been enough talk now, it's time to act. Since 2002, 779 Muslim men and boys have been held in Guantánamo. This means 779 lawsuits. This means 779 times dignity, truth, and justice. And for this, and only for this, we create these kind of tribunals. We take over the work of our institutions until they finally do it themselves, or until we finally take them over. Until war is called war again, and crime is called crime again. Until we have a law, a global constitutional state which acts with the global economy and its political powers. And my last words now, just writing them down. My own grandfather, so Kasha's grandfather, was born in Lviv, Ukraine, and had to leave the city as a Polish citizen because of the atrocities of the Second World War. I am a migrant with a Polish family, and I look and I hear about the atrocities happening in Polish forests to Syrian and Afghan refugees. And my solidarity goes to all the people in Ukraine right now. And I could cry, it's fucked. And all of the refugees in the world right now, we are with you. We are with you. Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear a video of Stephen Danziger. He's not with us today because he's under house arrest. He's a political prisoner. And he's a political prisoner because, as a lawyer, he battled a huge corporation, Chevron, to protect 30,000 farmers in Ecuador against environmental damage. He is a very brave human being, and he's being tortured, really, for his work on behalf of these farmers. Here he is right now, Stephen Danziger.
And I'm honored to take part in the Belmarsh Tribunal today. I want to say that I think what Julian Assange stands for is not only important principles of justice, but for something much larger than himself. And I can relate. Julian took on the national security state, and he is being punished relentlessly. Whenever you fight entrenched interests of power, you can expect pushback. In my case, as a human rights lawyer, I took on the fossil fuel industry, specifically Chevron, and I've gotten enormous pushback. And I also feel like my case stands for something much larger than me. And what the principle stands for, what I think Julian Assange stands for, is the ability of one person to be so successful at his work that he threatens powerful interests to such a degree they have to really blatantly violate the law to try to silence it. And I feel like that's something that has happened to Julian because of the national security state, and something that has happened to me and some of my law colleagues because of our human rights work and taking on and confronting the abuses of the fossil fuel industry, specifically Chevron. So I want to say today that I stand for principles of justice and fairness in the law. I call for the release of Julian Assange and the withdrawal of his indictment under the Espionage Act. And I also call on Chevron and its judicial allies to stop abusing the law to attack me and my colleagues, and also for Chevron to comply with the law and pay the judgment that the courts of Ecuador have imposed on it for its decades-long dumping of toxic oil waste onto indigenous ancestral lands. Thank you very much.
I'm very glad that Stephen Donziger was witness of our tribunal today. We visited him, a small delegation of the Progressive International, yesterday here in New York, where we talked about his case, and at our meeting he expressed his wishes that he would be the happiest if he could have been today with us. But unfortunately, because of the continued harassment of the United States government and the corporative sector, Chevron, he is not able to be with us and wasn't able to be with us. But we will keep you informed because the Progressive International will also fight for his case, and we tend to internationalize it. I'm honored that here in person we have the next witness, a very important witness, Jeffrey Sterling, who is an American lawyer and former CIA employee, who was arrested, charged, and convicted of violating the Espionage Act for revealing details about Operation Merlin. Thanks a lot, and a big applause for Jeffrey.
I'm very honored to be here. I think I might need to raise this a bit.
Yeah, it needs to be a bit higher, huh? Sorry. Working on it, huh? Better?
Okay. Yeah, I think that's better. Again, I'm honored to be here. For me, I had being wrongfully tried, convicted, and sent to prison for violating the Espionage Act. It was confusing for me during that entire process because I, as a student of the law, wondered how could our legal system allow someone to be sent to prison with absolutely no proof, with the government directing everything that could be disclosed in a trial, how the individual is able to defend himself, and really have no rights in a court. So being in prison, of course, I had a lot of time to think about that. I mean, what the hell happened? And because you have a lot of time to read in prison, I came across, again, a text that I had read many times before. It was Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. And in that letter, he was telling us about law, and that there's different types of law. There is the just law, a law that uplifts and empowers people. But then there are also unjust laws, the laws that subjugate a people to the will of its government, especially its revenge. And so, being an unjust law, the Espionage Act really is no law at all. I was convicted and imprisoned not on the basis of real law, but on policy, on revenge. I had the nerve to stand up to the CIA and say, "You are not going to discriminate against me because of the color of my skin." I had the nerve to talk about Operation Merlin, a faulty operation, aimed at Iran that could pose danger for the entire world. I had the audacity to do that. And my reward for that was being tried under the Espionage Act. Now, to me, the Espionage Act it's a tool. It's the modern day police dog or high-pressure fire hose that is unleashed upon those who dare stand up to government, to dare expose the wrongdoings and illegalities of government. It is a very cruel and unjust tool. It is not a law. Now, there can be an argument, just look at it as on the face of it. A nation preventing espionage act. Okay, there can be some reason found to support that sort of thing. However, there are instances when a law on the face of it is just, but in its application is unjust. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about the horrific segregation laws. The Espionage Act is just as abhorrent. With the Espionage Act, how it's being used is a clear indication that it is not a law. It is being used almost exclusively only to go after whistleblowers. John Kiriakou, Chelsea Manning, Reality Winner, many, many others. They had the audacity to stand up and say no to government wrongdoing, to expose government wrongdoing and illegality. And in that same vein of being applied unjustly, there is also the other aspect that an unjust law is a code that a government will inflict upon its people, but is not binding upon itself. So time and time again, we've seen, and it was really difficult to sit in prison and see Generals Cartwright and Petraeus being rewarded. They were not charged with the Espionage Act. They were eventually rewarded for their treachery, their lies. But this wasn't binding. If you're the favored in the US government, you receive special treatment. If you expose the US government, you get the Espionage Act. Has the Espionage Act really in recent times been used against any act of espionage? No, it's being used against whistleblowers. And that brings me to Julian Assange and what he's facing. I found it quite interesting during the extradition proceedings how the US, through the Queen's Counsel, was trying to give assurances about what Assange would face in a US court and in US prisons. And the Queen's Counsel had the audacity to bring my name up as a benchmark for what Julian Assange would face in a US court, and my 42-month prison sentence as an example of the type of sentence that he would be facing. I tried to come up with a description of what was going on there. One, it didn't have anything to do with truth. They were all bald-faced lies about what Julian's going to be facing. Facing the Espionage Act, this is the reality of what he's going to be dealing with. He's going to be dealing with a US government set on revenge. Let's face it, he embarrassed the US government, exposed their lies, exposed their treachery throughout the world. They are set on revenge. They were set on revenge against me for standing up to them. And they are using a law that gives them all the cards. They control the witnesses, they control the evidence, they control what's going on in court. And not only that, but he's going to be facing a court system, and specifically the Eastern District of Virginia, which as a court basically agreed in one of my instances, said that a black man standing up for his civil rights in this country is a threat to national security. That's my experience with that court. And this is a court that is more than willing to participate and encourage this continued illegal use of the Espionage Act. They're willing participants. They are evildoers, if you will, with regard to the Espionage Act. So my experience should not be any sort of benchmark. Instead, it should be a bellwether or a warning of what is to come should the US continue to be able to exert its will, and in this instance, extraditing Julian Assange. This is a chance for the world to stand up and say, no. US, you can't have your way in this. Don't talk about the rule of law in one instance and do everything you can to break it in the other. So, to me, just as individuals have the obligation, the responsibility to disobey unjust laws, nations of the world have the same responsibility to say no to the US, to refuse to be partners in use of this unjust law, because the dangers that are going to happen is the danger to freedom all over the world, particularly not only press freedom, but also freedom of speech. So it is time for the world to stop giving in to the US. We're not this bastion of justice as we try to pretend we are. I'm living proof of that. It is time for the world to say no, and it is time, long past time, for Julian Assange to be freed. Thank you.
You know, these human beings who are so brave, these hackers, these leakers, these publishers, we depend on them because without them, we wouldn't know anything about what our government is doing. So we have to hold them up as our heroes and work for them and encourage more leakers, hackers, and publishers to continue their work because we don't know what our government is doing. And it's important to know. It's important to know that to advance a peace movement, because if you don't know what your government is doing, you can't work for peace, because wars are always secret. Right now, we're going to hear from Chris Hedges, who is a remarkable journalist and wonderful human being who works with prisoners to this day, which has always been an amazing thing to me, how he finds time with his tremendously busy schedule, teaching and preaching and doing all kinds of wonderful things, to have time to spend time in prisons with prisoners. And his generosity is amazing, and I'm so glad he's here with us today.
Thank you. We know what Julian did. We know the great public service he provided. We know that he and WikiLeaks, aided by courageous figures such as Chelsea Manning, gave us the most important journalistic coup of our generation, ripping back the veil erected by the ruling political, military, and financial elites to expose their mendacity, their corruption, and their crimes. We know that populations around the world, from Haiti to Tunisia, were empowered by this information to hold these elites accountable. But today, I want us to reflect on Julian himself. For Julian, endowed with precocious skills, could easily have been someone else. He could have sold his talents to Silicon Valley, to Wall Street, or to intelligence and surveillance agencies who would have paid handsomely. He could have built a lucrative career, one where he was financially secure, perhaps wealthy. He could have obtained the possessions we are told in our consumer society we should aspire to: an opulent house, luxury cars, financial security, fine clothes, and the status that comes with material acquisition and advancement within the structures of power. No worries, no controversy, no persecution. But to follow this route, a route many have followed, would have required Julian to surrender his integrity and his dignity. It would have required him to forsake justice and freedom, to suppress and control the aspirations of the vast majority locked outside the golden gates of privilege and power. It would have placed him within the interlocking systems designed by the ruling elites to concentrate privilege, wealth, and power among themselves. It would have required Julian to become a cog in the mega machine, to play a part in constructing our corporate totalitarianism. Julian chose not to do this. He turned away from the siren call of success, at least as it is defined by the powerful. He set out on the difficult road taken by all who fight the oppressor on behalf of the oppressed. A life of meaning is a life of confrontation. When you resist radical evil, you jeopardize your career, your reputation, your financial solvency, and at times, your life. It is to be a lifelong heretic. When you stand with the oppressed, the crucified of the earth, then you are treated like the oppressed. You too are crucified. And that is what is happening to Julian. Those that care the most are targeted and killed by those who care the least. Prometheus, in defiance of divine prohibition, gave fire to humankind, making possible knowledge, art, science, technology, and civilization. For his empowerment of mortals, the gods sentenced Prometheus to eternal torment. He was bound to a rock, and an eagle, the emblem of Zeus, the emblem of power, ate out his liver by day. At night, his liver grew back. The next morning, it would be painfully torn out again in a never-ending cycle. Julian's story is the modern version of this ancient myth. For Julian gave us knowledge, and with that knowledge, he gave us power. For this act of defiance, he will never be forgiven by those he exposed. Albert Camus writes that one of the only coherent philosophical positions is revolt. It is a constant confrontation between man and his obscurity. It is not aspiration, for it is devoid of hope. That revolt is the certainty of a crushing fate, without the resignation that ought to accompany it. A living man can be enslaved and reduced to the historic condition of an object, Camus warned. But if he dies in refusing to be enslaved, he reaffirms the existence of another kind of human nature, which refuses to be classified as an object. Julian affirms the existence of another kind of human nature. He refuses to be classified as an object. His example calls upon us to confront radical evil no matter the cost. To stand with Julian is to stand with yourself. To abandon Julian is to abandon yourself. And if you abandon yourself, your life becomes a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
Thanks a lot, Chris. If I may add something to what you just mentioned, Camus, there is also another quote by Albert Camus which says famously that we have to imagine Sisyphus happy. Of course, we are unhappy today because all these atrocities are happening all across the world. But in a way, it is only through this kind of Sisyphean work, which these kind of tribunals are doing, and only through revolt and resistance, that we can actually find some moral ground in our dire times. And I would also add that it is thanks not just to whistleblowers like Julian Assange, Daniel Hale, Chelsea Manning, and many, many others, but also thanks to people such as Chris Hedges, who have reported from Iraq, from Yugoslavia, investigated the Srebrenica genocide. Thanks to journalists, we can prevent future wars. Thanks to them, we can know what is happening in our names. I'm very happy that I can present the next witness of the Belmarsh Tribunal, who visited Julian Assange many times at the Ecuadorian embassy and who also visited Edward Snowden in Moscow, German-Croatian theater director who has also made plays and also shows the importance of art. Angela Richter.
Hi, everyone. I must admit that I'm very emotional today, and I want to repeat one sentence that really took me. Today, every war is a crime. Thank you for Vijay saying it so many times. And yeah, we hear a lot about Europe now, and also many people say we hadn't seen this since the World War II, but of course, me as someone who's Croatian, I witnessed the war in the 90s in Europe, so that is also true. And I agree to everything that Vijay said, following his sentence, every war is a crime, because we shouldn't play out any children against each other happening in all these countries. Okay, and I think a lot of good things had been said today, and I don't want to repeat them because I could. I will not do it, and that's why I will confine myself to a very personal and subjective account of what I witnessed when I saw Julian the last time in the embassy. As Srećko said before, I have visited Julian Assange about 30 times between 2012 and 2018 at the Ecuadorian embassy. This resulted in 3 theater plays and a friendship with one of the bravest people I ever met. When I last saw him, Julian looked very pale. At that point, he hasn't seen the sun for almost 7 years. And I always kept saying that to people, how horrible already the time in the embassy was for him. I think people might understand that more today after we all experienced lockdowns all over the world because of the pandemic. And I know so many people who nearly went nuts just because of a few months at home. I mean, I nearly went nuts, honestly. So in hindsight, it's even more unimaginable what he went through already in this time. So yeah, to come back to the situation, I visited him at that point, and he was sitting opposite to me in the so-called meeting room of the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and we joked about him looking like Santa because of his long hair and beard, and yeah, he wore a thick down jacket. It was just before Christmas, and Julian had probably just had the worst time at his stay at the embassy. Since March 2018, he was de facto in isolation. No telephone, no internet, and no visits. The internet ban was particularly difficult for him. As we can imagine, it was not only his field of work, but it was also his only access to the world. So yeah, imagine lockdown without the internet. The mood in the embassy was very tense. They had turned off the heating even. That's why he was cold, and I also regretted that I didn't take something warm with me, actually. So I think that at this point, the embassy was hoping that he will leave by himself because they were maybe ashamed to take asylum from him. So to keep face, they were doing everything to push him out. But as we know today, 4 months later, he was violently dragged out of the embassy and is now being imprisoned for nearly 3 years in Belmarsh. We also learned, I was later reporting, not only that I did those 3 plays, but I was reporting for German newspapers from his trial, for all of the trials. And what we learned in that context, which many know, but I will repeat it again, is that the CIA spied on him in the Ecuadorian embassy, breaching human rights, and my own telephone was taken away. It was copied, and what is even worse, it happened also with his lawyers. So it's a big breach of human rights and his legal rights in Britain. And not that only that, but we also learned in the meantime that more than 30 former US Secret Service employees have revealed the plans to assassinate Assange in the US. These plans were hatched by the then director of the CIA and later Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And for me, it's absurd that that the Britons are even still trying someone to extradite him in a country which planned his murder. So I don't know. It's like human rights don't exist anymore. And this is something I also want to point out, because we in the West always think that, at least for us, human rights are guaranteed. You know, I lived with this assumption all my life, and what I learned from this case is we don't need them. I mean, I don't need them because I was never in the situation to challenge power. But in the moment, these human rights exist for one reason. For the moment, you need them when you challenge power. And that is why I realized that they don't exist at all. Because if they don't exist for Julian Assange when he challenged power and told truth, then they don't exist for any of us. It's just pure bullshit. So what has happened to him for years in the middle of Europe shows what could happen to anyone who dares to raise his voice and reveal the truth about the powerful. I also remember when I asked him how he was. This last time when I saw him, he looked terrible, to be honest. And I was asking him, okay, what can we do? You will be dragged out of here. You know, we already discussed it at that point. But he just didn't answer my question. He kept telling me about a new idea that he had, and he said to me, it could be as big as WikiLeaks. And he kept monologuing about an idea of inventing a very complicated system of anti-war insurance, an insurance where people would make money out of preventing wars. And I think it is a great idea in a way, as much as idealistic it might seem, but I couldn't concentrate listening to him because I was so worried about him, so I cannot even repeat everything he told me at that point. But for me, it's crucial to tell you this story because today we stand here and we want to be anti-war, and for me it's just this. I remembered this morning, this episode, him telling me about this, and so even in the moment when his life was in danger and he knew he will be dragged out and put in a prison, he was still thinking about how to prevent wars, you know? So that's what I remembered this morning when we decided to still do tribunal and come here all. Okay, so we are confronted with another war, not another in the world, because in my opinion, we never had peace, you know, to start with, you know. It's just one war after the other, and then some areas are more privileged than the others. But yeah, so my heart goes out also to, and my solidarity to the people of Ukraine today, to all the refugees from wherever they come in the whole world. And the last thing, free Assange. Thank you.
Sorry, I was overwhelmed. Our next witness is Nathan Fuller, who is a close friend of mine. He is a writer. He is the director of the Courage Foundation and also the executive director of Assange Defense.
Thanks, Margaret. And I want to thank Srećko for mentioning Daniel Hale here. Someone, oh, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you for mentioning Daniel Hale, just someone who really needs our attention right now. He was a drone whistleblower who has been sentenced to 45 months in prison and is now already in a communications management unit, so completely silenced in FCI Marion. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Progressive International for working together with Courage on this. I'm here to bear witness because I have covered up close what I feel are two of the most important legal proceedings of our time: the court-martial of Chelsea Manning and the extradition hearing of Julian Assange. In doing so, I've seen a single act of whistleblowing in detail to its conclusion, from unaccountable secrecy to conscientious objection to journalistic source to groundbreaking publisher. In the course of that last decade, I've witnessed the US government's attempts to so thoroughly smother these heroic acts of whistleblowing and publishing by Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange with lawfare, distraction, misdirection, lies. I have witnessed what the US government will go to, the lengths they will go to cover up its crimes. Once the material is published, I've witnessed the use of character assassination to exploit our obsession with personality to get everyone talking about the messengers instead of the message. Once the whistleblower is arrested, I've witnessed the use of solitary confinement to psychologically torture a human being, to attempt to draw out more information, but also simply to punish, to set an example for the next one. Once the whistleblower is on trial, I've witnessed the use of the Espionage Act to silence defendants on the stand, whereas Jeffrey explained, they are barred from explaining their motives. It was only after pleading guilty to lesser counts that Chelsea Manning was allowed to even say why she did this at all. Of collateral murder, she said, "I hoped that the public would be as alarmed as I was about the conduct of the aerial weapons team crew members. I wanted the American public to know that not everyone in Iraq and Afghanistan are targets that needed to be neutralized, but rather people who are struggling to live in the pressure cooker environment of what we call asymmetric warfare. As I hoped, others were just as troubled, if not more troubled than me by what they saw. And even when the whistleblower later has her sentence commuted, I've witnessed the same government rearrest her and attempt to force her to testify against her publisher. And we've seen all of the same and more against the publisher. Julian Assange has been threatened with 175 years in prison. He's already been detained in one way or another for more than a decade, kneecapping one of our most prolific journalists at the height of his powers. The CIA, perhaps the most powerful, secretive, and dangerous organization in the world, has plotted his kidnapping and assassination. And then he was arrested. In the last 3 years alone, Julian's been caged in the maximum security Belmarsh prison. COVID has infected his wing. He's been thrown in solitary confinement. And he's been subject to an extradition hearing in which he's not allowed to speak, and yet which has spent months and months and filled global headlines with a debate about whether he has the capacity to resist committing suicide. And all for what? All to prevent the next one. All because without journalists, we are uninformed. Without journalists, we cannot bear witness. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nathan, and thanks a lot also to the Courage Foundation for partnering in organizing this event. I think it's very important that already Angela Richter and you also mentioned the CIA plans to kidnap and murder Julian Assange. But I would also love to mention that some people here, his lawyers, including me, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't care that much, were surveilled by the CIA at the Ecuadorian embassy, which I think is a very serious problem going directly against the very concept of legality and what is possible and the privileged relationship between the attorney and client. So I'm very happy that our next witness at the Belmarsh Tribunal is someone who knows a lot about it, Deborah Hrbek, a New York-based attorney and WikiLeaks media lawyer. Thanks a lot, Deborah, for being with us today.
Thank you, Nathan, for being so tall.
Better?
Yes, that's better, thank you. As a media lawyer who's worked on a variety of book and film deals for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks journalists over the years, I am one of many US citizens who have visited the Ecuador embassy in London during his 7-year stay there. We were journalists, lawyers, doctors, academics, and activists who came to visit Julian as our client, our colleague, our interview subject, our patient, our friend. We perceived the embassy as a friendly place, and we were grateful to the Ecuadorian government for having given sanctuary to our friend, our colleague, our client. Upon arrival, there had always been a strict protocol for the protection of Julian, we were told. Passports, mobile phones, cameras, laptops, and recording devices and other electronic equipment were turned over to the security guard in the lobby. It wasn't until reports came out in the Spanish press in late 2019 that we learned that the security guards were not Ecuadorian government employees. Rather, they were employed by a private security firm based in Spain, Undercover Global, whose CEO, David Morales, had been recruited by the CIA, and that Julian's expulsion from the embassy and transfer to Belmarsh prison was accomplished with the complicity of the UC Global security team. We know this because some of the security guards blew the whistle. They had assumed, as we had, that their job was to keep Julian safe, perhaps from the British police, who openly surrounded the embassy 24/7, ready to arrest Julian if he stepped outside. The UC Global guards were distressed to learn that they had been used to collect information and provide it to the very same government that would now be prosecuting Julian in a criminal proceeding that could put him behind bars for 175 years. So like so many other brave souls who around the world discover gross misconduct in the course of their workday, they blew the whistle. What the whistleblower guards exposed was that the protocols that Julian's regular visitors had grown accustomed to had become increasingly invasive. Since Julian's arrival in 2012, the guards had been instructed to take copies of passports of visitors for record-keeping purposes, as they did with this peace activist friend of Julian's. Oh, she's already up there. But since at least 2017, the guards had been given different instructions. While visitors were meeting with Julian in the embassy conference room, the guards in the lobby were taking apart phones, removing and photographing SIM cards, and we believe downloading data from the guests' electronic equipment. Then their boss, David Morales, who appears to have been recruited by associates of Sheldon Adelson during a visit to Las Vegas for a tech conference, was making regular trips to Washington, D.C. to deliver thumb drives and to the Las Vegas Sands Hotel to receive further instructions from his handlers. Through an ongoing case in Spain, started in 2019, we have learned that in the later years at the embassy, every conversation Julian had was bugged. He suspected this and had been increasingly careful, but even Julian didn't realize that they had bugged the woman's bathroom, where he had begun to conduct sensitive legal meetings. There was also the recording device installed on the fire extinguisher in the conference room. And tucked behind the curtains. And hidden under knickknacks, as these photos of potential vehicles for recording devices indicate. We have a front of a trophy, a picture of the trophy from above, a picture of the trophy from the side, and from the bottom. A religious figure from the back and from the bottom, all looking to see where best to put a bug. Another bottom, and another bottom. This wasn't just a breach of Julian's rights, it was also a breach of the rights of his US visitors, of which I am one. As Americans, the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures by our government. The fact that we were in a foreign country, in a foreign embassy, does not deprive us of our constitutional right as US citizens to be free from unlawful searches and seizures by our government. The US isn't allowed to circumvent its obligations to the US people under the US Constitution simply by doing its work overseas. This is why we are preparing to file a civil rights litigation in the Southern District of New York to hold our government accountable for violating our civil rights. Through this court case, we will hope to shine a light on some of the activities of our government during our visits to the embassy in London. For example, while national security journalist Ellen Nakashima from the Washington Post was interviewing Julian, the guard outside was taking photos of her phone, her SIM card, and her tape recorder. While Julian was under secret indictment, they were recording his meetings with his US criminal defense lawyers, the late Michael Ratner, and in recent years, Barry Pollock. While Julian met with prominent US civil rights lawyers like Nancy Hollander, who's with us today, who was representing Guantánamo Bay prisoners at the time, US government agents had possession of her cell phone for the duration of her visit. And had Italian journalist Stefano Maurizio got the memo, she probably wouldn't have been carrying all of this equipment with her into the embassy. Think about it. During their meetings with Julian in the embassy, US criminal defense lawyers and national security journalists who may have had sensitive information from or about their US clients or whistleblower sources on their phones were unknowingly delivering their electronic devices into the hands of the very government who was prosecuting clients and sources whose confidential information they may have had in their possession. In keeping with WikiLeaks' commitment to shine a light on government misconduct and our firm belief that government transparency is critical to any democracy, through this case, we hope to bring attention to some of the appalling behavior by our own government against its own citizens, and if there is still justice to be found in our courts, we will be holding the US government to account. Any US citizens listening today who visited Julian at the embassy and who would like to learn more about this lawsuit, they should feel free to contact me or our Madam Co-Chair, Margaret Kunstler. Thank you.
Our next witness is Chip Gibbons, who is a political activist and the policy director of Defending Rights and Dissent.
Thank you very much to everyone, and thank you to the Belmarsh Tribunal for having me today. There's going to be some people who are going to say this is not the right time to be talking about US war crimes with Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine in the headlines. Of course, to many people, it's never the right time to talk about US war crimes. But I actually think right now, with yet another war breaking out in Europe, and with people on both sides of the conflict saying or pursuing, as opposed to diplomacy and de-escalation, a wider war, that this is exactly the moment in which we need to be talking about the realities of war. And that is what Julian Assange is wanted for doing, for exposing the brutalities and criminality that make up war, for showing the deceit and deception that make up empire. The Belmarsh Tribunal is particularly important to my organization, Defending Rights and Dissent, because in the US, we've created a system where people carry out war crimes and other abuses of power, go free and profit from them, and truth tellers are put in jail. Let's do a where are they now from the war on terror, if you will. George W. Bush right now, a lot of people in the media are quoting him about how shocked and outraged he is that in the 21st century, one nation would invade another sovereign nation. Very shocking concept to him. On the other hand, though, Chelsea Manning, who exposed the Iraq War, was tortured twice, convicted under the Espionage Act, and spent more time in prison for giving information to the media than anyone else. The architects of torture and mass surveillance have no shortage of career opportunities in government, in war profiteering, and as cable news talking heads. Turn on CNN or MSNBC, and you'll see them telling you what you should think about the news of the day. On the other hand, John Kiriakou is the only person to go to prison for the CIA torture program. What was his grave crime? He confirmed on TV the US was engaged in waterboarding and George Bush had authorized it. Another CIA whistleblower, my friend Jeffrey Sterling, is here today. After many years of doing online events together, this is our first time in the same room, which I'm very excited about. NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden is in exile. Another NSA whistleblower, Thomas Drake, beat the government's Espionage Act charges, but not without great personal cost, because the process is part of the punishment. And even when you beat the government, they still win. FBI directors who terrorized the Muslim community, trampled upon dissent, and somehow managed to run afoul of the few remaining checks on surveillance. And they've really lowered the bar to when you can surveil people. So to break their own rules, it's remarkable. They just keep doing it, and they keep getting more and more surveillance powers, and they keep going farther and farther. They're lauded as champions of the rule of law. Meanwhile, Terry Albury, an FBI agent who gave information about the FBI's domestic war on terror, just recently was released from prison after serving time under the Espionage Act. The weather's not very good outside today here, but I imagine wherever Barack Obama is, he's yachting with rich people or recording a podcast with celebrities. Meanwhile, Daniel Hale, who exposed how 90% of those killed by U.S. airstrikes were not the intended target, is sitting in a communication management unit called Guantánamo North in a federal prison system right now. There's really no words yet in the English language to describe what it is that Donald Trump does or is doing, but we should note that Reality Winner is recovering after having been imprisoned under the Espionage Act for one of the longest sentences. And my personal favorite, Dick Cheney, is being paraded around the floor of the House of Representatives by Nancy Pelosi as a hero of democracy. Which brings us to Julian Assange. Julian is not a whistleblower. He had no quote-unquote duty to protect classified information. He's not even an American. All he did was give a platform to courageous people to come forward with information that should be in the public domain, and the US government wants to extradite him under the Espionage Act. He's been subjected to arbitrary detention and torture, and he's in conditions in Belmarsh prison right now that many people have correctly described as a slow-motion execution. And that's the first reason why this is so important, because we need to put the real criminals in the docket. The second reason is the Espionage Act, which has been the running theme for my talk, prevents us from doing just that. Not only does it scare people into silence, a whistleblower charged under the Espionage Act cannot tell a jury what they exposed or why. Daniel Hale, in his recent legal proceedings, before the trial even began, the prosecutor asked the judge, and this is their words, to bar Hale and his attorneys from mentioning Daniel Hale's good motives. And the judge agreed, said, nope, you can't mention your good motives, Daniel. Which is the norm for the government to ask for this and for judges to grant it. And it makes sense from the government position, because imagine right now you're called for jury duty and you're sitting there and you hear about drone strikes that kill civilians, you hear about attack helicopters that gun down journalists, global programs of disappearing, torturing, and imprisoning people, and then the US government turns to the person in the docket, whether it's Daniel Hale, Chelsea Manning, or Julian Assange, and says, that person right there, they thought you had the right to know this, and we want you to help us disappear them into a supermax prison or a communications management unit so they cannot tell you the truth anymore, and we set an example to other people who might do the same. I know how I would vote on that jury. How would most of you? And this is why the Belmarsh Tribunal is so important, because we are doing what the court systems won't do. And I'm here today representing a civil liberties organization that defends the First Amendment, but my background came from organizing against the Iraq War. And one of the most powerful things we used to do were these hearings with Iraq veterans against the war, where soldiers would talk about what they saw. And I actually watched the collateral murder video in a room with one of the soldiers who were in it. And at Defending Rights and Dissent, we've been working to platform and give voices to whistleblowers, including drone whistleblowers, including Daniel Ellsberg, including Jeffrey Sterling, to talk about both what they exposed and both how the government treated them. Because this may be naive, but I still believe truth-telling is an act of resistance. And that is why I'm proud to be here.
Thank you, Chip, and we're also proud to have you here. I know that our tribunal today is already taking 2.5 hours or something, but let me comfort you. First of all, we have 2 more speakers and a little surprise. The video testimonies of Renata Villa, Yanis Varoufakis, Miedin Grupe Bitnik, and many others who were announced, we will publish in the following days. But there is also some comforting thing in a secret report of the Rand Corporation about the Russell-Sartre Tribunal. They said the Sartre-Russell Tribunal was taking place for 8 weeks. Now imagine we're here for 2.5 hours and some people maybe feel tired. 8 weeks. And they said if they don't die out of boredom, it will be a huge embarrassment for the United States. And actually it was. And I hope this tribunal will also be a huge embarrassment, not only for the United States, but for all war criminals around the world. So I'm really excited that our next witness is our brother, Cornel West, American philosopher, political activist, and public intellectual, and first and foremost, our brother.
What a blessing to be a witness at this historic Belmarsh.
I think we don't see the video, so apologies to everyone who is watching, but that's the charm of the Belmarsh Tribunal, to have this kind of. Now comes our brother Cornel West.
What a blessing to be a witness at this historic Belmarsh Tribunal, building on the rich legacy of keeping track of war crimes of a variety of empires. We're focusing on the U.S. empire and the way in which it is continuous with earlier empires, and every empire is tied into lies and crimes and mendacity and criminality. Now, I very humbly speak from the vantage point of a people who have been hated for 400 years, but keep dishing out love warriors who have been traumatized for 400 years and keep dishing out wounded healers who have been terrorized for 400 years and keep dishing out freedom fighters. And the precondition of a love warrior and a freedom fighter and a wounded healer is what? To tell the truth, to expose, to reveal, to disclose, to unveil, to pull the cover over the lies and the crimes, the mendacity and the criminality. And here we are in 2022, sitting here in Harlem. You can see the precious brothers and sisters in this particular neighborhood, part of that same rich tradition in the face of predatory capitalism and its expansions around the world, in the face of white supremacy in all of its various forms around the world, male supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, whatever ideology that loses sight of the humanity of people and its ways in which it gets intertwined into imperial orders that lose sight of colonized, ex-colonized, poor people, working people, disproportionately in the world, people of color. So when I think of my dear brother Julian Assange, exposing the war crimes of the US government, George Bush, 5 drones dropped, innocent folk disproportionately. Barack Obama, 535 drones dropped on precious human beings disproportionately in so-called third world, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia. No accountability. Very few raising their voices. This tribunal has the courage to pursue truth, and the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, including the suffering of the victims of US imperial policy. Martin Luther King Jr. said what? My own government is the largest purveyor of violence in the world. The US empire, the largest empire in the history of the world, 800 military units around the world, AFRICOM on the African continent, and the sphere of influence in Latin America, treating Latin American countries as if they were just their backyard. Here comes my dear brother Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks says, let us show the world the underside of the American empire, the war crimes. But we've seen the invasions and occupations of Iraq, we've seen it in Grenada, we've seen it in Iran, we've seen it all around the world, 20th century and the 21st century. And all we want to do is just to bear witness, to be a cloud of witnesses who cast a spotlight on the war crimes of the U.S. empire, an empire that understands itself too often as a city on the hill, the beacon of hope, the exemplar of liberty and democracy. And we simply say, let us pull the rug from under kind of narrow, truncated, and thoroughly misleading characterization. The ways in which to move from perceived innocence to corruption without a mediating stage of maturity, the move from becoming great and powerful in terms of military might and money and unbelievable wealth has not yet allowed America to grow up, to come to terms with its crimes, come to terms with its lies. That's what this tribunal for me is all about. Got the painting here of El Greco, Toledo, empire in ruins, relics. Why? Refusing to come to terms with the truth about itself, thinking that the efficacy of lies can serve as the very means by which you move through history, through space and time. Belmarsh says no, in the name of truth, in the name of justice, in the name of our decency as moral human beings in solidarity with our brothers and sisters of all colors and all nations, all gender and all sexual orientation, all religions, all secular sensibilities. We are in solidarity with their suffering to make it visible and to end on a note of resistance, resilience, with vision, courage, organization, and yes, my tradition, blues man with a little style and a smile. So in the face of this catastrophe, it will not have the last word. And in the face of these catastrophes, we will, in the name of those who've come before, who struggled so, Franz Fanon called them the wretched of the earth, in the name of the blessed, precious wretched of the earth, of all colors, hold up a bloodstained banner, a blood-soaked banner, and say, crimes will not have the last word, but rather our voices, our movements, our joys, our hopes, our visions, and our precious love for our brothers and sisters.
We have another surprise coming up, but before that happens, I want to just say that we're not powerless. And we owe it to the truth tellers and the people who have provided us the information to get out there and show that we understand and show that we can do it. We can all get together, we can get on the streets, we can create a peace movement that is so large and so important that we can end all of this craziness, all of this butchery, all of these terrible things that we know about that are not hidden from us. They're not hidden because of the truth tellers. Now, we've done this before in this country. We've had mass movements that have achieved things. We've had an anti-war movement that was so effective in the Vietnam period that the government had to change its entire policy. Why were we successful in the Vietnam movement? Because we had the information, we heard it all the time, we knew what to do with it, and we also had something else. We had the draft, which brought home the terrible things that are happening. But there's another way to bring it home, and that is to show the terrible things that wars, expenditures sacrifice in terms of humanity. I mean, we have 1 in 6 children in this country, we're the richest country in the world, going to bed hungry. How is that possible? And that's as powerful as the draft. So what we have to do is understand that the way that the government responded to the Vietnam War was to cut out information, was not to allow journalists to report on the war. They had to embed the journalists, so they entered the information. What they did, the sympathy for the draft, they had to end the draft. So, but we have all of those powers now. We've gotten them back. We have to use them. We have to get on the streets as we did before, and we have to stop this. And it's our responsibility. We can't let just whistleblowers stand up and tell us about it. We need to do something in the streets, and we have the power to do it. We can't be depressed. We can't say, oh no, it's our responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Margaret, for co-chairing this event with me. It was a great honor. And I think it is very important what you say. I would add, in my own words, that being depressed today is a luxury. Being hopeless is also a luxury, especially for those who are not in countries which are being bombed at the very moment as we speak. So it is our duty today of us who are free, who are not bombed, to stand for those refugees and those who are victims of war. The point of this tribunal today was to renew an even stronger, maybe stronger than ever, internationalism today, to renew and to build an even stronger anti-war movement than ever, because there is also the nuclear threat, about which we didn't talk today, and which is here, and it will always stay here until the end of the world, if you want. The point of this tribunal is also to try to protect whistleblowers and journalists and refugees, and many refugees today. So what we prepared for the ending of this tribunal is something very special. It is a recording by Roger Waters and his fellow musicians, Holly Lessig, Jess Wolfe, Gus Seifert, John Carin, and Joy Vironker, and it was filmed by Sean Evans and Kay Deezer. And although Roger Waters himself in his introductory speech will say to him the song is dedicated, if I may, I would love to dedicate it to all refugees today, to all victims of war, and to all those who miss their families, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, their mothers, their children. This is Roger Waters and his band performing Wish You Were Here. A big applause.
Canyon in LA. We did this on Wednesday, but we're really, really proud and happy to be with you all and the People's Forum for the Belmarsh Tribunal. Right, hang on a minute. I've just got a couple of words to say before we sing a song for everybody. This is something I came across recently, and I wrote it in October 2015, and it was a sort of open letter to Shaka Arma. For those of you who don't know, Shaka's an English bloke who was locked up in Guantánamo for 14 years. Anyway, I finished a letter I wrote to Shaka Arma saying this: Shaka Arma, you are a man of incalculable spirit and courage, and doubtless also faith. Your indomitable resistance in the face of remorseless persecution lights a corner of the dark. We owe you an enormous debt of gratitude. Welcome home, my friend. With great respect and love, Roger Waters. Well, substitute the words Shaka and Amar with the words Julian and Assange, and then you get words I had wished to utter years ago and hope to be able to utter tonight or tomorrow morning or the next morning, but let's let this drag on. Here's how it sounds. Julian Assange, you are a man of incalculable spirit and courage, and doubtless also faith. Your indomitable resistance in the face of remorseless persecution lights a corner of the dark. We owe you an enormous debt of gratitude. Welcome home, my friend, with great respect and love. And then I signed my name. So let us prevail upon the ruling class to do the right thing and set Julian Assange free. Shall we sing the song? So you think you can tell heaven from hell, and blue skies from pain? Can you tell a green field from a cold steel ray? A smile from a veil. Do you think you can tell? And did they get you to trade your heroes for ghosts? Hot ashes for trees, and hot air for a cool breeze, cold comfort for change. And did you exchange a walk-on part in the wall for a lead role in a cage?